I'm Sarah Wilson and you're listening to the Roots and All podcast. I'm here to help you get growing. Join me as I explore everything plant related both indoors and out and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the podcast. This week I've followed up a listener suggestion and I'm interviewing Dr Liz Dauncey, a botanist with a PhD in plant taxonomy. Liz spent most of her career as a botanical toxicologist working for the poisons unit of Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital in London on joint initiatives with the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew. She worked with the Horticultural Trades Association on their harmful ? Campaign that introduced a list of 117 plants on sale in garden centres that should carry warnings on their pot labels. And she now works freelance, writing books, providing information and advice about plant toxicity and undertaking poisonous plant surveys. Liz is author of Poisonous Plants, a guide for parents and childcare providers, and is co-author of Plants That Kill, a natural history of the world's most poisonous plants. Plants That Kill is now also available in German, Dutch, Italian and Japanese, and I know, thanks to my podcast stats, that I have listeners in every one of those countries, so you can all go and buy a copy of Liz's book immediately if your curiosity is piqued by this interview. First of all, I'd like to apologise for any sound quality issues. This was the most difficult episode I've recorded so far. It was beset by technical glitches, and also regular listeners may have realised that I've got a terrible cough and cold, and I had to keep pausing the interview to cough in poor Liz's ear, but she was very understanding. Thanks, Liz. I started out by asking her about what we should be looking out for in our own gardens. One of the most interesting questions to me is, in the average UK garden, we have got plants that are poisonous and probably plants people don't realise are poisonous. But can you tell me which are the two most deadliest but common plants we might find in our gardens?
Yeah, so common, it's interesting. Combining common and deadly is quite tricky for me because when I go places, I just look at the poisonous plants. But I think it's probably foxgloves are the commonest really poisonous one. Mm-hmm. So they would affect your heart if they were eaten. And then it gets a bit trickier. There aren't so many that are really common, but aconitum's and delphiniums. Delphiniums are quite common nowadays, aren't they?
Yes.
And then you've got your autumn crocus maybe, but again, that's not that common. So that I think you'll find that the really nasty ones aren't as common in an average garden.
Right.
They're in a big garden would possibly have them.
Right. And which are the kind of the nastiest ones you could have?
Yeah, so that would be aconitum, colchicum, castor oil. It's the seeds of castor oil, but the other two, it's the whole plant. They're the ones that I'd worry more about.
I was just thinking, actually, I had a castor oil plant in a customer's garden and I collected the seeds and I was driving around with the seeds in my van for ages and ages and ages on my dashboard. So presumably you're safe to do that. You're not going to get arrested under anti-terrorism laws. No, it's fine.
No.
Okay.
You can just buy the seeds quite easily. They're not a prohibitive substance unless you actually chew the seed up and swallow it. Then they're perfectly safe. And
that's an interesting point, actually, isn't it? Because I think it was the castor oil plant that you mentioned in your book where if you were to swallow it whole, it would just pass through. It's the chewing that breaks down the seed coat. Is that correct? Is that the right plant?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's it. But also abrus, the little rosary pea, that's got very similar toxins, but they're fine if you don't actually chew them.
And is that the same as you describing them as ordeal plants? Is that the same thing? Is it the fact that it could break down or it might not, and that's the gamble? Can you explain what an ordeal plant is?
Okay. Yeah, the ordeal plants, it's to do with if you chew them quickly and swallow them down, you'll probably be sick, and that'll limit the toxicity. But if you're very nervous, say you're guilty, then you might nibble on them. And the toxins, just the more serious symptoms take effect. So, yeah, it's more likely to kill you.
Okay. And they were used to determine whether someone, bit like kind of dunking a witch, presumably, to see if you were guilty or not. And right, okay.
Yeah, but there's all overlaid with it could be apparently rigged by, they give you a seed that they know is slightly less toxic or not so much to eat. So there's different ways of actually influencing the outcome.
And also, I was going to ask, so maybe not in our gardens, but in the kind of wider environment here in the UK, which are the deadliest plants, again, that we might just stumble across that are quite relatively common?
Oh, well, it'd be foxgloves again, out and about. And then we don't really have that many deadly ones. You've got the yew trees, but as you know, the red fleshy bit is perfectly safe to eat, and people spit out the seeds or they pass through intact. So you don't get poisonings from yew unless you intentionally eat the leaves or chew the seeds. Yeah, they're the only really nasty ones that we have in the UK. You know, the ones like cuckoo pint cause oral irritation and make kids sick, but then they're no more than that, really.
No, I mean, they are eye-catching. I can imagine you might want to have a go at them.
I mean, I suppose we've got deadly nightshade. That isn't actually that common in the UK, but it has been eaten in mistake for edible berries. They're apparently very sweet. They smell really nice. So people do eat them in quantity. We haven't had a death from deadly nightshade for a very, very long time.
So talking about foxgloves and being deadly, how much would you need to, presumably you need to ingest that, and how much would cause you harm?
Oh, I really don't like doing quantities. It varies so much. It's part of the plant, the time of year, the size of the person, you know, whether they've got any underlying health problems. But also it's not, you know, it's just not a thing. You only need to worry about that if you're trying to treat someone who's taken some of the plant material.
Okay. And that actually, I suppose, leads on to one of my questions, which was, is there one particular group of people who are more susceptible to poisoning or who might suffer greater effects from it?
Well, most susceptible, the smaller you are, so children are more susceptible than a larger adult, or older people who couldn't cope with, say, vomiting and diarrhoea from eating a poisonous plant. They're the ones that are most at risk. But if you're a healthy adult, you can cope with more.
So you mentioned the aconitum in a garden, and I know there was a case, sadly, a couple of years ago where a gardener actually died from poisoning from an aconitum. And I know you're quite keen to talk to me about that. Are there misconceptions about aconitum and how it works on the body and how we might be poisoned by it?
Yeah, so it was widely reported in the newspapers, this very tragic case, but they didn't report quite so widely that the coroner's verdict was an open verdict, and that he said that aconitum was extremely unlikely to be the cause, partly because the gardener in question probably hadn't even handled it. So the information that we have about handling is from florists who strip the leaves from the stems, so they handle it a lot, fresh green material, and they get a bit of tingling and numbness in the fingers, might get heart palpitations, and that's the limit of the toxicity through that route. I mean, it's used in systems of medicine, say Chinese medicine, they actually include it in a liniment for certain external conditions. But they have detoxified it a bit, but it's still slightly active. So contact isn't so big an issue. I mean, I would wear gloves if you're going to do a lot of handling of the plant, but it's through eating it that it's really poisonous. So that's the misconception of aconitum. If you think how many thousands of gardeners have grown it and handled it in the UK over the years, you know, it can't be as poisonous as it was reported in that particular instance.
No, I mean, it's amazing, as you say, as gardeners, a lot of people don't even wear gloves. They don't feel comfortable working with gloves on. So they will be coming into contact all the time, presumably with things that could cause you damage. And you don't hear about cases of people becoming ill from that even, let alone, you know, any deaths. No. Yeah, okay, well, that's really interesting, because that's another thing. When I was growing up, I had a horse, and we used to go into the paddocks and get rid of the ragworms because obviously, well, I don't think it's such an issue when it's growing and it's alive, but I think, as you say in your book, when it dies and get mixed into hay, it then becomes more palatable and it can be eaten by mistake. But we did used to go and pull it up as a matter of course, but never wearing gloves. And that's another one that has these alkaloids that can cause you harm, and they can pass through your skin. But does that mean we always need to be wearing gloves? Are we at risk, especially long term, if we continually handled something like that without wearing gloves?
Well, the ragwort, again, is another slight misconception. So the contact problems, some people get allergic reactions to it because it's a member of the daisy family, and that's it contains lactones that can cause allergic reactions. They're different to the toxins that are a problem if you eat it. You don't absorb large amounts of these toxins through skin contact.
And of course, there are plants that can cause other problems when they come into contact with our skin. Some contain sap that reacts to sunlight. What are some of the plants we might have in our garden that could have that effect?
Oh, yeah. So in the garden, there's something called garden rue, Ruta graveolens. And then out and about, you've got the giant hogweed. To a lesser extent, you've got the common hogweed. That also contains these toxins. And then something that people probably don't think about is parsnips. When they've bolted and you're clearing your beds the next spring, if it's a sunny day, then you can get these contact reactions from contact with the sap in combination with bright sunlight. And the sunlight can be slightly after the contact with the sap.
And is giant hogweed as bad as people make out? I mean, I've driven down the roadside where I live and I've seen people have put tape around it and literally set fire to the plant. Is it as horrendous as people think?
Giant hogweed is pretty nasty if you get the right conditions. You do get very nasty blisters and they last quite a long time. And then your skin is sensitized to the sunlight for months, sometimes years. It depends on how bad the exposure was. So it's an invasive species. So it's using up habitat space for native plants. So we need to eradicate it for that reason as well. Although it apparently is quite a good nectar source. So, I mean, there are two sides to all these discussions. But from the phototoxicity point of view, yes, it is nasty. So if you're controlling it, you do have to take precautions. You have to actually wear waterproof gloves and clothing if possible, because you don't want the sap getting through to your skin.
Right.
And people also, they handle it in the evening so that they've got time to wash themselves completely and all their clothing and their equipment before any exposure is possible to sunlight.
Right. And presumably as well, your eyes, you need to watch your eyes with it, do you?
Yes, yeah, definitely don't want to get the sap into your eyes. Burning is not the standard way of controlling it. That's quite interesting. It wouldn't do any long-term good. I mean, it would remove, if there are seed pods, maybe they're waiting till it's got dry and it's the fastest way to remove the seeds. That could be the way they're thinking.
Yeah.
But the plant themselves below the ground, the crown will just resprout the next year.
Or they could just be Daily Mail readers who took it upon themselves to carry out a bit of vigilantism against dangerous plants. You never know. So the carrot family, they're actually quite nasty, are they? They are probably our nastiest natives. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, when you asked about native plants, I should have mentioned the carrot family, because we've got hemlock and hemlock water dropwort are two commonest, very poisonous plants. So hemlock you'll see along the side of motorways, they like dampish ground, and hemlock water dropwort prefers wetter ground, so along rivers, streams, even ditches and roads where it's wetter. So with hemlock water dropwort, it's the roots. They can be mistaken for wild parsnip and eaten. The leaves similar to wild celery, but also they're dangerous to livestock. If you've got them on your drainage ditch in your farmland, and their water can wash away the soil around the roots, and they might be eaten by cattle, for example.
I must tell you this story. I had a client once who had a paddock. She'd let her horses graze in it, and it was very low lying, and the ground had got poached. It'd been sitting really, really wet, and it was absolutely full of this weed. So I went down to have a look, and through my amateur botany, I decided it probably was hemlock water dropwort. I kind of dug up the roots, had a look, looked at all the leaves and the stem and everything. I came back up and I said, look, you're going to have to get rid of that, because of the horses and the kids and all the rest of it. In the meantime, my client had gone down to have a look at it and came back, and she said, I can tell you it's not parsley because I ate some. And she was fine. Absolutely fine. But she was a member of the medical profession, and I was just amazed how easy it is for people to just, stick a bit of a plant in their mouth and taste it, or it's almost a natural reaction to do that, to sniff it, but sometimes it's not advisable, is it?
No, I mean, I imagine she just ate a tiny nibble, because you tell really quickly if it was parsley or not. And to be honest, I'd probably do the same with plants. It's just assessing the risks, really. It's actually very difficult to eradicate hemlock water dropwort.
Right.
So it might be easier to just fence off the area and stop the animals getting there, really.
Yeah, I mean, I just couldn't believe it when she told me she'd eaten it. But yeah. One thing I think that became quite apparent as I was reading your book was that a lot of cases involve people who are foraging and are trying to eat out of the natural landscape. It's less common that gardeners have problems. Do you think that's fair to say?
Yeah, definitely, yes. Gardeners, we don't get that many cases from. No. I mean, it's people who mistake something for being edible, which would be a forager, or possibly if you thought your daffodil bulbs were onions. That's becoming less common now.
Yeah, I read about that. That was an actual case, wasn't it, in Bristol?
There have been quite a few cases. Again, if you're elderly, you're more susceptible to the effects, because theoretically it shouldn't be fatal. It's just incredibly severe diarrhea and vomiting, which can lead to electrolyte imbalance. And then, if you don't get the correct treatment, then it does lead on to much more serious effects. So it's mistaken identity is the biggest thing.
Do you think that the narcissus is one of the most common accidental poisonings, or are there others kind of worldwide that crop up now and then?
Worldwide, I mean, it's a completely different
different
picture,
game, yeah.
No, daffodil's not very common at all, actually.
Okay.
No.
Okay. I was listening to another episode about houseplants in particular, and I wondered, they were discussing the US version of mistletoe. I don't know what the species is, but it's obviously different to our European one that we commonly get at Christmas time, because they were saying that theirs isn't poisonous, but I think ours is. Is that correct?
Oh, okay. The toxicity of ours is quite complicated, and it's not actually particularly poisonous. It's a theoretically poisonous plant.
Right.
They're probably restricted mainly to the seeds inside the fruit. So again, you have to chew them,
right,
which people just don't. And it's not an attractive plant to actually eat. And you can actually get mistletoe tea. So.
Oh. And that's made of the leaves, is it, or the berries?
Yes, the leaves.
So I suppose that does bring us nicely onto houseplants. Again, there are some that I've grown and specified and supplied to clients that actually are quite harmful. One of the ones that I've actually sold on is the euphorbia, and I don't know how you pronounce this, but I'm going to have a go. It's tirukali.
Oh, yeah.
Which is a fairly common houseplant, but actually,
it's a nasty one.
Yeah, that does look quite iffy to have indoors. And crotons are another one that are quite common and that you mention in your book as being quite dodgy to have around. Are there any other house plants that we commonly grow that are really quite dangerous?
Okay. Well, the croton that you probably supplied would have been the Podium variegatum. They're not the same as the croton that's very poisonous.
Right, okay.
It's one of those the names are confusing. But the nastiest group of houseplants are the ones in the arum family. So you've got the dumb cane is probably the nastiest one. But all of them, so you've got painter's palette and peace lily and spathiphyllum, that is peace lily, sorry, the philodendron epimedium, is it? There's a whole group of these houseplants. Potentially they all have the calcium oxalate crystals. That would cause oral irritation, and then you can get swelling, and the crystals allow the entry of irritant toxins into your mouth and any soft parts. So if you swallow it, then you can get restricted throats, restricted airways, as well as the pain. But it's mainly the dumb cane, so the Dieffenbachia, that's the nastiest one.
Okay. And that's if you eat it, and presumably that's more of a problem, I would have thought, for animals and possibly children, is it?
Yeah, so interestingly, in Scandinavia, they get a lot of cases of these houseplants, I think, because they have the long winter months, so they're not going out so much. North America, probably just because it's such a big country, they get an awful lot of cases from the arum family houseplants.
I suppose I should ask you, is there anything that you wouldn't grow in your own house or garden, plant-wise?
I wouldn't grow garden rue.
Okay.
And I'm very selective with euphorbia.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah, I grew aconitum all the time. My daughter was growing up. She just proudly said to her friends, mustn't eat that because it's very poisonous.
Yeah. Bless her. You taught her well early on. Yeah. I mean, it is a scary one sometimes. If you're planted up someone's garden, you might shy away from something like that if you couldn't be there all of the time to make sure everyone was educated. But
yeah, I think I probably would. You do different things in your own garden. But
yes.
My advice to other people is if you've got small children, then you might want to not grow it for a while or put it at the back of the border. There are usually ways around it. So if you've got a plant that has berries that you worry about, then you can lift the branches out of the way, or you can trim it after flowering so that it doesn't set fruit for a few years.
Uh-huh.
So it's managing risk.
So most of us know not to eat rhubarb leaves or green potatoes, and And also I heard that parsnips that remain in the ground too long can be a bit dodgy. But what are other things that are really common that people might not be aware of and that could cause accidental poisoning?
Maybe the things that poison animals, their pets, so that you don't think about. Raisins has only been known of for a relatively short period of time. So dogs shouldn't eat grapes or any of the dried versions, or fruitcake, for example.
Yeah.
And then with cats, it's the lilies. So any part of the lily plant, they eat it, but they can just brush against the pollen. And then if they lick the pollen off their fur, that's very bad for cats. It's the only cut flower that's actually labelled with a warning about eating it, sort of generally. Although daffodils are now in supermarkets say not to be eaten. But lilies say mention that it's poisonous to cats.
Right.
I wouldn't grow those in the garden.
No.
Because I have cats, and you have other people's cats could come into the garden.
Yeah, actually, I have to say that's probably the only thing. I do worry a little bit about things, but I do grow most things, but I don't grow lilies because I've got cats too. But I was reading as well that Eremurus seeds can kill cats and dogs because apparently they're barbed seeds and they hook onto their coat. This isn't really related to the poisoning element, but they hook onto the coats, and then if they were to sniff up a seed, it kind of the only way is up for these seeds, so they can end up in their brain and actually killing them. So, which I had no idea about.
No, I've not heard of that one.
Yeah, I think the site that I was reading was based in the States, but yeah, it is scary when you stop and think about it.
Yeah, and then if you have anything that's vaguely grass-like or is grass-like but has rough edges, that can be very nasty for them because they cats and dogs will eat the grass for their digestion, and then it irritates too much.
And the other thing that I think I've done quite a number of times is had a fight with a horrible overgrown laurel hedge. Am I right in thinking that can be sometimes a little bit dodgy as well?
So cherry laurel, are you talking about?
Yeah.
Yes, that's cyanogenic glycosides. So when the plant material's damaged, then the chemicals mix together and you end up with cyanide being released. So if you're working on it to any large extent, make sure it's an open area. If you're shredding, don't do it in the garage because people have been overcome by fumes that way. And I've heard that more than one occasion where people bagged it up and then felt dizzy when driving the bags of chopped up material to the tip.
Yeah, I heard that.
So it's anecdotal, but I think it's probably based on fact.
Well, actually, when you're shredding laurel or even cutting it, you do get quite a strong smell from it. So I could well believe, that it is giving off something. Is that the same for burning? And is there anything that you maybe shouldn't put on your wood burner at home because it's giving off anything?
Yeah, so wood burners nowadays, they're supposed to be quite sealed, aren't they? So they shouldn't be giving off fumes into the house.
Uh-huh.
But if it's an open fire, then I would be careful with if you know that the wood is from a known poisonous species, then I would be careful about burning it in an open fire or something that you do get the smoke coming in. So laburnum even.
So I wanted to talk about just briefly at the end, really, the point in plants having poisons. So I get that they deter herbivores if they've got quick acting effects, but what really fascinated me was the plants that have the longer term effects that you touch on in your book. So they could potentially be cancer causing, or I think it's also, is it teratogenic, where they can cause problems in embryos. So what is the point in plants having and containing poisons like that would have such a long-term effect? Is it just coincidence that they're there?
I think some of them are just coincidence, and they also tend to have on say insects have a faster acting mechanism as well. Teratogens you can sort of understand, because if you end up with your predator not having viable offspring, then that's a way of reducing overall predation. The things that cause cancer after you've eaten them a long time, how does that happen? I don't know.
And how would a plant, again, this sounds probably a bit of a daft question really, but how would a plant know that having a high concentration of a particular chemical will deter a predator? Again, is that just coincidence, or is it an evolutionary process that's evolved? How does that come about?
Yeah, it's just evolution, survival of the fittest. So having the high concentration of this particular compound gave some evolutionary advantage to that that plant. So it had more offspring, and then its offspring, the ones that had that compound, will have survived better than the ones that didn't, etc. So it's just a very slow process of evolution.
And also you get some plants who've got toxins that actually persist in their predators. How does that work, and what's the point in that?
That's one of the active fields at the moment. It hasn't been studied until fairly recently, so they don't obviously have all the answers yet. But it can work in various ways. So one of which is the toxin works on most predators by affecting a certain chemical pathway. Say it blocks an enzyme working properly. Then if you happen to have an adaptation that means the structure of that particular enzyme is slightly modified, then the toxin won't be able to bind to it, so you won't be poisoned by it. And then you can actually store that chemical in your tissue, and it's not doing you any harm.
Right.
But if you're eaten by your predator, then they could be poisoned by it.
Okay, and just to wrap up, what is the oldest example of a plant that's possibly been used as a poison?
I don't know, actually. I mean, I think they found various things in these bog bodies. They found ergot alkaloids in them. Yeah, see, we just don't know, because ergot can be just contamination of grain, or it could have been taken intentionally to numb them or whatever in some way before they died. I don't know.
God, that's fascinating. What is the absolute number one deadliest plant in the world?
I hate this question.
Sorry.
It depends what you mean. I mean, I can't answer that question really, because it depends on so many things.
Okay, fine.
I think we've covered quite a few really poisonous ones. So.
But yeah, that's fair enough. Which one wouldn't you want to meet on a dark night?
Well, apart from the contact ones, I don't think I'd like to eat hemlock.
No. Is hemlock poisoning worse than the strychnine? Because that sounded fairly horrific as well.
Yeah, but I don't really think about the ones that are in different countries. That's another level of complication. Strychnine, that is nasty. That is a nasty way to go.
Yeah, it sounds it. There's lots of cases in your book that you refer to of poisonings, but is there anything that is genuinely untraceable?
No, everything's traceable.
Now, I know you have a new book coming out, which is about plant cures, which sounds as if it's the polar opposite of plants that kill, although it's not actually. What I found interesting is that some plants are beneficial in certain measures and yet fatal in others, and even that some poisonous plants provide antidotes to other poisonous plants.
The reason I do these books has been that I want people to actually see plants as being useful to them and worth preserving, worth worrying about. I know there's a bit of plant blindness you hear talked about now. So yeah, I just want people to know how interesting and wonderful plants are.
They are, yes. I think you might be preaching to the choir. People that listen to my podcast.
Yeah, that is a trouble, but it's not. Yeah, but it's worth saying, I think.
It is. It really is. Yeah. To go back to how they can be so good and so bad, one of my clients, I put in a Phytolacca americana in their garden, and it didn't survive actually in initial planting. And they wanted me to source them another one because he's a doctor and he uses that in his work, as a positive thing. So, and yet in the garden, it could potentially be quite a bad plant were you to eat it or do anything daft with it.
Yeah, it's strange. I've seen someone selling that as an edible plant.
No way.
I took issue with them a bit and they said, oh no, you can eat the leaves. And I was thinking, oh, I wouldn't.
No.
Really?
Actually, that's a really good question. I'm just going to ask you this because on Gardener's Question Time, Bunny Guinness ages ago said when you pinch out your sweet pea plants to encourage them to be more bushy, you can eat the clippings that you take off. But obviously sweet peas are different to normal garden peas. Do you know whether, they're Lathyrus, they're odorata, are they going to be dangerous for you?
Off the top, this would completely off the top of my head.
So I'm not going to. No one's going to hold you to this.
I wouldn't eat them. I mean, they'd probably be all right as a one-off. There's a thing called lathyrism.
Yeah.
That you get from other species of Lathyrus. It's when people actually eat the seeds. They use them for a flower, But there are certain conditions where it causes the poisoning, because if you're using it as a famine food, so you're not balancing it out with other food sources, and I think you have to be on a low protein diet, and you take it long term, then it's poisonous. Sweet peas, people don't use in the same way.
No.
So we won't have had cases of people being poisoned by sweet pea shoots, but that's if people started to regularly eat them because they were pinching them out, then maybe we'll get cases.
Yeah, so probably, unless you're starving, maybe don't do it. No.
Yeah, but Bunny Guinness is doing it. She's still around.
Well, she looks pretty good, so maybe it's working for her. Yeah. So there you have it. Perhaps the key to Bunny Guinness's radiance is sweet pea salad. However, that's most definitely not endorsed by Dr Dauncey or the Roots and All podcast. Well, I hope you managed to bear with me despite my snotty voice and the various other sound quality issues. The good news is that Liz says she's happy to be interviewed again when her Plants That Cure book is published in 2020. So I look forward to a follow-up episode where we can discuss the heroes of the plant world instead of the villains. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next Tuesday. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website www.rootsandall.co.uk, where you'll also find my blog and a sign-up form for the newsletter, which gives you a weekly roundup of content, plus the inside scoop on things like upcoming guests. Or you can subscribe wherever you normally get your podcasts. Email me with comments and feedback at podcast@rootsandall.co.uk. Follow me on Twitter, Roots and All, Facebook, Roots and All UK, and Instagram, Roots and All Pod. But please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support my work, because if you like what I do, please help me to continue doing it. Even if you make a one-off donation of £1, trust me, it all helps, and I will be immensely grateful. So please go to Patreon and search for Roots and All.